How NASA learned to love four squirmy letters. Decades after sending it to design Purgatory, the space agency celebrates a logo it still calls the worm. Last month, NASA welcomed Richard Dan to its headquarters in Washington to celebrate work he had done nearly half a century ago. Mr. Dan never studied the stars. He never built a rocket, but he and his design partner, Bruce Blackburn, came up with one of the most recognizable elements of the space agency. The logo known as the worm with the acronym NASA spelled out in bold, sinewy, orange red letter forms. The worm endures, even though NASA dumped it more than 30 years ago, returning to the meatball, its original logo, with a blue circle, stars, an elliptical orbit trail and a swoosh representing an airplane wing. In the past few years, the worm's clean, futuristic look has experienced a renaissance inside and outside the space agency. It is now prominently splayed on the sides of spacecraft, t-shirts, sneakers and souvenirs. This summer it became three-dimensional, a massive sculpture in front of NASA headquarters and a picturesque background for tourist snapshots. "I love being part of pop culture," said Mr. Dan, 89. Look at some of NASA's recent spacecraft, like the Orion capsule that went around the moon last year, and you'll see an unexpected mashup of the two logos. Some might say they come from different planets. David Rader, NASA's creative director, said during the event that celebrated Mr. Dan and the worm last month. For half a century, it was one logo or the other at the space agency. NASA started using the meatball in 1959, a year after its founding. It was the logo on Neil Armstrong's spacesuit when he stepped on the moon in 1969. The worm is a child of the 70s. A small, newly formed design firm, Dan Blackburn, won a contract from the National Endowment for the Arts when that body was seeking to give federal agencies a visual remake. Mr. Blackburn, who had designed the symbol used to mark America's bicentennial celebration, played with various pictorial approaches but settled on a futuristic take on the four letters of NASA. The two as prominently lacking crossbars suggested rocket noses or engine nozzles. "It was extremely simple," Mr. Blackburn said in 2015. He died in 2021. "It was direct." The work delivered to NASA by Mr. Dan and Mr. Blackburn went far beyond just a four-letter logo. They also put together a compendium of dos and don'ts, the proper size and usage of the logo, placement of any accompanying text, the specific shade of red. The graphics standards manual sought to give a cohesive appearance across the agency and its centers around the country. "This is something that didn't exist prior to our redesign," Mr. Dan said. "The publications and forms were quite a mess, radically uneven in both language and appearance." Mr. Dan said much of the work was devoted to the visual decluttering of the NASA organization. They rewrote NASA's forms to make them shorter and clearer, and those shorter forms saved on printing costs. They specified standardized layouts with limited combinations of fonts, which allowed NASA to put out publications more quickly. "The fact that it looked better was kind of frosting on the cake," Mr. Dan said during the panel discussion. Still, many NASA employees disliked the worm intensely and felt that the meatball, representing the triumphs of the Apollo program, had been thrown away and replaced with something sterile and soulless. After the loss of the Challenger space shuttle and its crew of 7 in 1986 and early problems with the Hubble Space Telescope and its out-of-focus mirror, morale at NASA suffered. In 1992, Daniel S. Goldin, appointed as NASA administrator by President George H.W. Bush, sought to rekindle the excitement of NASA's early days and announced the return of the meatball. His farewell to the worm was not unlike the soliloquy of a movie villain about to dispatch the hero. "Slowly it will die," Mr. Goldin said to an applauding audience at NASA's Langley Research Center in Virginia, and never be seen again. The headline in the South Florida Sun-Sentinel: "Worm turns, NASA junks despised logo." Except the worm never completely went away. People like Michael Birut, a partner in the design firm Pentagram, lamented the loss. The worm is a great-looking wordmark and looked fantastic on the spacecraft, Mr. Birut told the New York Times Magazine in 2009. By any objective measure, the worm was and is absolutely appropriate, and the meatball was and is an amateurish mess. In 2015, Hamish Smythe and Jesse Reed, two designers then at Mr. Birut's firm, used a crowdfunding effort to bring the graphics standards manual that Mr. Dan and Mr. Blackburn had created for NASA 40 years earlier back into print. The document is now in its 7th printing, and more than 35,000 copies have been sold. A couple of years later, in 2017, Coach approached NASA, hoping to put out a collection of NASA-themed jackets, sneakers and bags, and they wanted to use the worm too. I went back to our legal office, said Bert Ulrich, the entertainment and branding liaison at NASA, and they said, well, maybe you can use it in a vintage sort of way. And so then we started permitting it again. That's when the worm started popping up on t-shirts again. In 2020, NASA sent the worm back into space on the SpaceX Falcon 9, the first American rocket to take astronauts into orbit since the retirement of the space shuttles. Just as Mr. Golden thought the return of the meatball would excite NASA employees who wanted to recapture the glory days of Apollo, the NASA administrator in 2020, Jim Bridenstine, thought the return of the worm would be inspiring to those who, like him, grew up with it as the NASA logo. I've always been kind of partial to it, Mr. Bridenstine said then. Now the worm is back, and the meatball is still there too, still the official insignia for NASA. The agency put together a committee, including Mr. Dan and Mr. Rager, then working at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, to figure out how to use the logos together harmoniously. The use of the worm remains limited, a supporting element to our insignia, Mr. Rager said. You have to have special approval to use it. We try to use it on applications where it's big and bold. On the Orion spacecraft, the worm appeared prominently on the adapter ring between the capsule and the service module, providing propulsion and power, while a small meatball was painted on the capsule, next to the American flag. The meatball feels like a government agency logo that has some weight, he said. It lends a really nice authority, and it feels connected to the legacy. But the meatball is a complicated graphic with multiple colors and not easily recognizable at a distance. The worm is kind of the opposite of that, Mr. Rager said. So those two things kind of balance each other out. Your free account gives you access to many of our newsletters. Sign up for ones that interest you. You can always opt out or make changes, Mr. Birut, one of the participants on the panel discussion last month, has warmed up to the meatball a bit. If you Google me and this subject, you'll find me saying that the meatball is a terrible, terrible, terrible logo, he said. And I have revised my thinking about it since then. The meatball was the product of a culture similar to that of the armed forces, so the idea that the insignia as a patch represents kind of an allegiance to you, your colleagues, and to the mission you are serving is really important, Mr. Birut said. Mr. Dan still doesn't love the meatball, but he is proud of the worm's return and content with the coexistence of the two logos. They're so different, he said. We found a way to make it work. Is it ideal? Probably not. But it's pretty close to being good, and it satisfied everybody, so I can't argue with that, Mr. Rager said. People at NASA used to fall into two camps, meatball versus worm. Since we reintroduced the worm, I have not heard that, he said. In fact, now that that division isn't a thing as much, people are appreciating both. Art of the seal. Some things seem doomed to divide us. Lennon versus McCartney, Yankees versus Mets, boxers versus briefs, and so on. If you love one, you'll probably loathe the other, and each camp makes an equally convincing case as to why its choice is right. For design nuts, one of those alpha versus beta divisions is choosing between the two logos of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA. One is the symbol that NASA adopted in 1959 and still uses today. It's the NASA insignia, commonly known as the meatball for the obvious reason that it looks like one. The other is the logo that replaced it from 1975 to 1992. It, too, has an official name, the NASA logotype, and a similarly self-explanatory nickname, the Worm. The arguments in favor of both are steeped in space race romanticism, but they also tell us why some organizational identities, to give logos their posh name, seem so special. First, the meatball, introduced the year after NASA was founded. The agency already had an official emblem in the seal, on which its name was written in full around a picture of a spacecraft orbiting a cluster of planets. Like many logos at the time, it resembled an ancient heraldic crest, in the hope, presumably, of evoking something powerful and imposing. NASA decided that it needed another, less formal logo and asked James Modarelli of the NASA Lewis Research Center to design it. The result is a cartoonish version of the seal in a patriotic palette of red, white and blue. The spacecraft orbits the initials N, A, S and A in a starlit sky. It's those stars that resemble a meatball's dimples and an elongated V in the shape of the latest hypersonic wings. The effect is sly.